So I woke up this morning and looked at my YouTube recommendation. That was a big mistake, and now you get to suffer for it. Welcome back everybody to me talking about books and other stuff. And today we're going to talk about the big question, do Nazis have a right to escapism? Or something like it. So, let's go. Cheers. All right, let's unpack all of this. I literally woke up with the title, Do Nazis Have a Right to Escapism in my brain, and being the proper journalist that I am, I started developing a video around that backwards. It's how all of us work. We have a title and a thumbnail, and then we go on. Anyway, my point is, I do have some ideas on escapism and conservatism and stuff like that I want to talk through today. And the reason is, obviously, I wasn't making a joke there, me looking at my YouTube recommendations, and it seems BookTube has died. It's now Rings of Power Tube and House of the Dragons Tube. And obviously, I haven't watched those shows, but I figured I'll just try to actually get some of that cake as well. And part of that is obviously what people talk about when they talk about Rings of Power, which is 2 or 3 sane people going out and saying, you know what, it's actually a really cool show. And then everyone else going, but it has elves of color and we hate those. And a long argument around all of that. Now, that's obviously nothing new. We've seen that before, people complaining about all kinds of stuff when Wheel of Time came out as a show. And I'm like, look, the books are shite. We know that. But they're shite for reasons that are different reasons than people complaining about the show, which I haven't seen and I will not watch, because why the fuck would I want to do that? Anyway, my point is, there's been a lot of talk about adaptations of fantasy stories on all kinds of screens that you might call racist, sexist, and all kind of other ists. But not the good ones like communist, you know? And the question is, and there's obviously people out there that think that is, fantasy fans are right-wing and conservative. And the question is that the case? Or what's going on there? And that's what I want to explore today, because obviously there's fantasy fans out there that are a lot of things, but they're not right-wing. Like, you know, they're like progressive, they're smart, they're inclusive, they're kind people, good people, not assholes. And the question is, what's going on there? Why do we still have that reputation? And what's the basis for that? And should we maybe talk about the problems with that? So let's unpack all of that. And to do that, I'm going to do the one thing that you were all expecting. I'm going to quote that one essay that I read recently and already talked about in my video yesterday. And that is On Fairy Stories by J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, it's important that we have, you know, that, I mean, go and read the essay. It's actually really good, or at least massively important for fantasy literature of the last 50 years, so maybe go and read it. It's long, it's 40, 41, 42 pages, depending on what you have. But yeah, I promise you it's important. And I want to look at 1 or 2 things there, and then I want to look at 1 or 2 other things in the beginnings of what you might call popular fantasy of the 20th and early 21st century, and look at like how that was conducive to all these racist outbursts whenever someone tries to take a popular fantasy story and make it more inclusive. And then I want to argue why that's bullshit, and also why we should actually fight that narrative. So let's go. Tolkien, in On Fairy Stories, among a lot of other things that he says that are clever, among some self-deprecating humor on how he's not qualified to talk about the Blue Fairy book by Andrew Lang, which, incidentally, Terry Pratchett makes a wonderful joke about in The Light Fantastic, which is a book you should read again, and don't believe the people on the internet that tell you that this world only gets good around guards, or maybe Weird Sisters. No. Color of Magic and Light Fantastic are fantastic books, and that joke about the fairy book in there is really cool. And now you know more about it than you ever thought. Anyway, my point is, Tolkien talks about fantasy stories, which in this case is the context of fairy stories. He talks about what fairy stories are, what fairy stories are not, and he makes a bunch of important points. I want to look at one of those, and that is, and maybe later at a second, and that is the idea of escapism. And he talks about escapism, how escapism is actually good, necessary, and, try to defend it against those people that don't like it, which is, all those serious literary folks or pretend serious literary folks that think like escapism is for children, basically. Tolkien says, no, that's wrong. Escapism is always in order when someone is in a situation where they feel trapped and they can, and he makes that most important example, which is a prisoner who imagines the outside world because that's the only way for them to keep sane, to stay sane, and send their minds out into a imaginary world. That's where escapism comes from, escaping something. And that's great. And it's like, that there is a need for that. And that's an argument that you can see other people make, and it's a good argument. Yeah, escapism is, in fact, actually kind of good. If you feel trapped, oppressed, and locked into a terrible place in your life, then sending your mind to wander out into, a place that is better can be helpful. It can be healing. There is healing to be had. It can help you keep your sanity. Fantastic. Escapism is thus part of fantasy, and it's an integral part of fantasy, says J.R.R. Tolkien, and who are we to argue with an actual professor of linguistics? No, my point is, escapism is one of the functions of fantasy literature, of fairy stories in this case, and has always been that, argues Tolkien. And obviously, when you look at how we actually deal with fantasy over the last 50, 60, 70 years, it's always been there. So there we are. Now let's look at why people think fantasy is conservative. We'll stick with J.R.R. Tolkien for a second, but I promise you we'll also go over to someone else, my good buddy Robert Irvin Howard. All right, the dark side of On Fairy Stories is that it's probably one of the most conservative texts that Tolkien has ever written, or one where his inherent conservatism or anti-progressivism comes through the most. Now, Tolkien obviously didn't like industrialization, he didn't like progress, which he mostly connected to engines, industrialization, technological progress, and so forth. And there's a lot of reasons why that is the case, and we've seen it when you read Lord of the Rings, mourning for the forests that have been cut back, coming back to the Shire, which has been taken over by factories that, destroy the landscape. You can see he's going to be one of the Green Party nowadays, which is good in theory. The problem is that the way he formulates all of that on fairy stories is more extreme. He makes very clear that it is all about progress and people thinking the new is better than the old and so forth, that is a problem, and that things get lost that were actually good and get replaced by stuff that is not necessarily better just because it is newer. He does not make explicit claims on social progressive social movements. He does not do that, but it is easy to imply that as well. And he makes that first important connection for escapism, which is if you feel trapped in the modern world, which in Tolkien's case is a world of machines, of robot factories, of glass-roofed train stations, all of these terrible, terrible things, then escaping to a better world of trees that can talk in specific language is actually worthwhile and is one of the things that fantasy can provide. And that is actually good because it can heal your soul. All right, there we are. First version of, escapism into a lost past, a golden past. And we'll come back to that again and again because it's important on that one side. Let's move over to our good buddy, Robert Irvin Howard. Now, you all know Robert E. Howard. He wrote a bunch of really incredible stories about Conan of Cimmeria, Cole of Atlantis, Bran MacMorn, Last King of the Picts, and a lot of racist stories, more explicitly racist stories about Solomon Kane. Anyway, My point is that all of those stories are also set in a past, and that is where we have the more social aspect. Robert E. Howard was a very troubled person, and I'm not a Howard scholar. I'm not going to go into all the depths of that. It's worthwhile. He is an incredible author, don't get me wrong. But he was not happy with how society was going at his time in Texas in the 1920s and 1930s. And his escapism, his return to stories that are set in a fictional past of our Earth, are, very much about a time where men could be men and, solve every single problem by sheer willpower and violence. And that's another form of escapism. We have the everything was better before, technological progress, on the one hand, which is Tolkien's version of conservatism, and we have everything was better when society was more patriarchal and men were not such wimps. Yes, basically, Robert E. Howard is already fighting soy boys all the way back in the 1930s. It's interesting, isn't it? My point is, those are two of the key strands of modern fantasy. And both of those are conservative in their views or in the world that they present to their readers as a place to escape to heal their minds and heal their souls from the troubles of modern day. So, let's move on. And let's see why there is more. All right, so we have those basic ideas. Escapism per se is a good thing. It can help people heal people's souls and minds when we struggle and are oppressed by the world. And that is something that has always happened. It's at its root possible and accessible to each and every one of us, no matter our background, no matter why we feel fucked up by the world, whether that's legitimate or not, doesn't count here. It's a subjective thing. If you feel trodden down by the world, going into a better place in your mind is an option, and it's a valid option. Escapism is valid in that regard. So how do we end up with most fantasy being taken over, or most classic fantasy being taken over by people that are upset by black elves? Now that's what I want to look at some more here. All right, so over time, societies move to what you might call the left, I would call to a more progressive side. They become more inclusive. That's always happened, and that's a good thing. It could go much faster, and I'd be more happy. But what that means is that people, and you've heard that before, I assume, people that were on the top of the food chain, that were the most privileged group, do lose some privileges. And that's, just part of that, because suddenly everyone else has the same rights as well, almost everyone else. And that's fine. That's actually good. But it can feel somewhat bad for those people that are no longer special, even though they, want to claim that they aren't really special, especially if you are. And we're not going to go all the way down to this whole, where does the alt-right get their people from? I don't want to go there today. There's enough videos out there for that. My point is that people that suddenly feel no longer like they are kings of the world, whether they ever have is a different question, but whether feel oppressed by this, taking away of their privileges which they deny they have, do suddenly feel oppressed by society. They feel they feel the need for an escape into a world that is better. They feel the need for escapism. And that's, once again, that's understandable. So where do they go? What options do they have for escapism? Well, there's all kinds of fiction. There is movies, there is television, there is computer games nowadays, there's fantasy stories, there's science fiction stories, there's horror stories, there's everything out there. But, and this is the problem that we need to talk about, capitalism does something here. It's not one of my bashing capitalism things, it's just looking at a mechanism here. Over time, See, when you start to enfranchise more and more parts of society by slowly becoming slightly more human to them and giving them at least some rights and not discriminating them as badly and marginalizing them as badly as before, those people become more active in what you might call society, culture, and whatnot. And sooner or later, mostly later than sooner, they get some, representation in all forms of media being the thing that we use for escapism. And suddenly, our first group of very privileged white cis male heterosexual males even encounter those symbols for their oppression, their imagined oppression. I have to make this very clear, right? Their imagined oppression, even in their realms of escapism, and that's terrible. Now you can look at how this, goes from one medium to the next. Television starts fairly early in that trend, and science fiction has always been a bit iffy because it's all about utopias, and sometimes those utopias are egalitarian. Who could have imagined that? Stuff like that, And my argument here is that the three last ones that we have in media, or some of the last ones, are comics, computer games, and fantasy stories. And here's the thing. When your options for escapism slowly disappear, are taken over by the people that already annoy you in the real world out there, that actually drive you to go and do the escapism, right? Then you're going to get more and more, desperate and aggressive when it comes to defending your last form of escapism, which is, at this point, well, probably only fantasy and possibly comic books, which I'm not exactly aware of. And see, the point is, that's why I brought up capitalism. That whole, representation, a more inclusive form of media, is driven by capitalism. There's no woke conspiracy. We all know that in our hearts, right? It's just if more people buy stuff, then we do the thing that more people buy. And if, the world has become, if more groups of society have money to buy stuff, they want to see themselves in those media. So there's a capitalist incentive to become more inclusive when it comes to media, and that's fine. That's actually good. But it leads to the fact that those people at the beginning, that we're talking about, those, right-wing people, basically, feel more and more oppressed, even in their, comfortable places, and their safe spaces, in their escapism places, until almost nothing is left, and they see the reality even encroaching on their fantasy lands. And that's where we are right now, which is when we start, talking about elves that are non-white. Isn't even Tolkien safe anymore? That's where we are. And I think there is, how can I say that? Look, it's completely wrong that people are like that, but I can see how they end up in that situation, is what I'm trying to say. But unfortunately, there's more, and that's what we need to talk about now. And that is fantasy, the escapism that fantasy provides, necessarily conservative, if not even more than that? And there's good cases to be made for that. And obviously, not all fantasy, not even all classic fantasy, is conservative in nature, but a lot of it is. And a lot of the most influential stuff is, which is why I brought up Conan and why I brought up Tolkien. And there's some elements in there that are important. Those realms of escapism, the fantasy worlds, the secondary worlds, if you might call them this, are always in the past. They are in a glorious past, in a better past. And they tell the story of, oftentimes at least, with, Tolkien, this is obvious in a way. They talk about how there was a glorious past, and they talk about an epic struggle, and about a return to a glorious future, to a golden future. That's an arc. Obviously, that's a narrative that you need to be wary of, because, there's people that told that story, and I'm German. I'm allowed to say that, but they were Nazis. However, there's more elements there that are sort of almost proto-fascist, which are, you need the concrete. It's the love for the concrete. It's the abhorrence of the abstract, which means fantasy stories, often classic fantasy stories, oftentimes break down threats to the world into very concrete things. There's a personified evil that you can go and kill, and then everything will be good again. You have concrete, good leaders that lead, personified leaders. You have one person that goes and does the thing, does the killing of the evil one. It's that element that you find in Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. Conan solves his problems through willpower and violence, through his, mighty thews knit to the keen fighting brain. That's how he solved those problems. And those are elements that are very attractive to a very specific worldview. And you find those in, classic texts for modern fantasy. So does that mean that fantasy is inherently conservative and racist and fascist? Of course it doesn't. Because when you look at Lord of the Rings and the story that Tolkien tells there, it's not a fascist narrative, even though I almost framed it that way right now. It is something else. Tolkien talks about mythology. Mythology, per se, is not necessarily racist or fascist or anything like that. It's not. And Tolkien would be far away from, we have proof. Tolkien is not a Nazi, was not a Nazi. He did not approve of Nazi things. He was just very conservative. But the problem is that those texts were taken and copied by a lot of authors, as we do when we have influences, and a lot of people did that with Tolkien, with Howard, and they did not necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about what those authors wanted to say. They just took the trappings, the story elements, and perpetuated them, and tried to build their own thing out of it. And that's where, at the end of the day, you have those key narratives. We have an abstract problem, we break it down to a Dark Lord that gets killed by our leader guy, and problem solved, everything's better again. And that's what remained, and that's what gets, perpetuated over time. And that narrative in itself can be, locked on by fascists and conservatives very easily. Unfortunately. So yes, fantasy can be very seductive to a very specific part of society, which unfortunately is the same kind of group of people that feel kind of done dirty by society and feel the need to go and escape from it by taking part in media and watching fantasy, reading fantasy, or other things. So they find something here, and we have this confluence of two different things that lead to a lot of people with very conservative views, to put it mildly, ending up in fantasy and seeing now even those elements, slowly vanishing. And that's why they fight back as viciously as possible against anything possible out there. Which is where we are when you go and watch Rings of Power discourse on the internet. And there's obviously more to be said about that, but this should not go on for too much longer, so I want to look at one or two additional elements before I close this. First of all, I mentioned it before, fantasy has, the potential to be all kinds of things that are not conservative, that are not racist, sexist, or anything like that, and that provide a form of escapism for everyone. We have seen, all kinds of forms of fantasy worlds that never did that all over the history of fantasy. We've seen C.L. Moore write her Girel of Joiry stories in the 1930s about a female main character fighting monsters and thus being a role model for women. Fantastic. We've seen Ursula Le Guin writing very, very interesting non-conservative fantasy and science fiction, positive, utopian, escapist literature over her career. We've seen a lot more, obviously in modern days, in newer times, when slowly the market was opened for became more inclusive. We had more writers of more diverse backgrounds bringing their elements, their dreams into the fold, thus making the whole thing much more progressive. But we also need to go and talk about, Is it okay to change a story like Tolkien's? This is where I'm gonna bring the whole thing around to the end and go back and once again look at on fairy stories, because Tolkien himself did actually talk about that. It's like mythology changes over time. And that's how it stays vital. We add more things. He has this wonderful image of the pot of soup, which he calls the soup story of a soup of stories or elements, a cauldron, so to speak, where all kinds of elements are thrown in. Parts of our experience are added to it, and out of that primordial soup of story elements, that's what we tap to create our escapist fantasies, to create our worlds which we go to when our world out here becomes too hard to take. And that means, yes, we add new stuff to it. We take stories that we love and we make them ours. We change them over time so they stay relevant. That's how we've always dealt with mythology. You look at the classical Greek mythology, those stories changed over time and were malleable in ways that, unless you look at them, you wouldn't believe. You look at the Odyssey, you look at the Iliad. There's elements in the Iliad that weren't there in our oldest versions of it. There's heroes like Theseus, the guy with the ship, right? When you look at the Theseus myth, it got changed over time to become all kinds of things depending on how Athens felt at the times. We know that. It has always happened. And isn't it great that now we have stories like Lord of the Rings, a new mythology, which is exactly what Tolkien tried to create, a mythology for his homeland. Let's forget the homeland bit there for a moment, but, a new mythology. And it stays relevant because we add to it, we change it, we make it more inclusive, we make it something that more people can adapt. That's exactly what we're supposed to do with it. That's how a myth, a story, a tale actually transcends the first text and becomes and stays relevant. And that's what we need to do. And people that claim otherwise and hold back to one specific version of a text are holding that transcendence back. They're fighting a rearguard action, and they're wrong, because looking at 10,000 pages of notes and shopping lists where one word of elves is written on by Tolkien does not tell you how the story should be told today. It just tells you what Tolkien thought about at one specific moment in his life, and that's not how canon works. That's how canon works when you have one person deciding how they feel. And that's not how stories stay relevant. That's not how mythologies stay relevant. And you know what? At the end of the day, I want Middle-earth to stay relevant. I want the Middle-earth mythology to stay relevant for as many people as possible. And I'm glad it's happening. And that's, I think, why we need to actually fight back when people claim those kind of things. Because while I understand that, yeah, those people want a place to retreat to as well. But you know what? I don't want that to be my place. I don't want to deal with those people in real life. So why would I want them in my escapist, wonderful place that is, for example, Middle-earth? So yeah, those were my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed them. I would really love to hear your thoughts on the whole thing. Thanks if you made it this far. Let me know what you think. Comment, like, subscribe, share, join the Patreon. I'll promise I'll make it a better Patreon at some point very soon. But mostly, please let me know your thoughts. I'd really love to hear them. And if you happen to have a video, a YouTube channel and do booktube or whatever, I don't know, make a video on it, make a video response. Let me know what you think. I'd really love to talk about this because I think we need to talk about these elements. Anyway, have a great day. Cheers.